This letter.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Oh. You know, Meredith joined my two lots at the lake. And I didn't complain in the time frame that you had to complain.
So you
When
got
they
tax
do.
higher.
No, I think it would have been, if I kept the two building lots, the taxes would have been higher than seeing it all as one. So, which is one of the reasons I didn't complain, but I think that my evaluation would have been,
Recording in progress.
you know, for selling it
Yeah,
or whatever,
yeah.
but I knew I'm never selling it. I'm never selling it.
Right.
The basis for the house is my condo that I bought in 1972. You can imagine how much capital gain there's been. So I have to die owning it unless they change the tax stuff. Try and keep us from doing that.
The still next to Dave Waters.
Yes, I am. The neighbor on the other side, who was a friend, the couple had been a friend of the Wadhams. And she just sold last year, or her husband died about 10 years ago. And she had been coming up, but coming up less and less, and her daughter didn't come, and her son lived in New Jersey and came for a week.
Set.
We're all set.
Good evening. My name's Mike Wolke and welcome to the Hopkinton Planning Board hearing meeting of May 12th here in 2026. I think we have a quorum. We do have a quorum and 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, which means that everybody here can vote. And I think we only have one item on the agenda from which to vote. We have, Dean Owens, we have Alyssa McKeon. Ask Molly, it takes me a long time. Malia Hardenberg, Rob Dappis, we have Jane Bradstreet and Jim Femina, and of course, supported by Karen Robinson. So the first thing is a review of the minutes from April 14th, 2026. Give you a minute to glance over them, and if anybody is ready from which to make a motion to approve or not approve, or to make amendments with it, please just speak for it.
I reviewed the minutes previously, Mr. Chair, and I'd be happy to move to accept the minutes from April 14th.
Second.
Okay, all in favor of approving the minutes from April 14th, say aye.
Aye.
Or you can say aye too, and that means it passed. Anybody opposed? Hearing none, it's all good to go. Alrighty. Conceptual consultations. This is the opportunity for anybody who has questions that are, free in nature. As are, nothing is final from this, but it's an opportunity to ask a question. I do want to make a statement. Yeah, please identify yourself.
Sure. J.R. Hull, owner Genesis Systems out of Dunbarton regarding a property on Branch Londonderry Turnpike.
All right, I just want to kind of, you know, state for everybody has a good understanding of it. This was just received
Okay,
and it's not on the agenda for
Okay.
tonight. There's been no notice to, you know, abutters
Mhm.
as to, you know, anything associated with what you're asking here.
okay,
So we, you know, for this conceptual, you know, I think we're more than happy to answer a conceptual
Right.
on ordinance overall.
yep,
But anything specific which you've addressed within here
Mhm.
is not a continuation of the preliminary application
okay.
that we had before. Okay, that would have to be submitted in and put onto the agenda for our next meeting.
So we didn't get answers to questions we asked last time, and that's why we're back.
If you have a general question
hmm
regards the ordinances, anything relative specific to the preliminary application that was discussed, I'm afraid we really can't address it.
So how do we proceed, I guess, given that the design firm is kind of on hold, not having answers? We can't move forward. So it pushes out the project another month before we can be on the agenda. These were questions that were asked. These are no different than the questions asked last month.
And we may not have gotten to them or answered them, but, you know, I would also say that, you know, you had the opportunity to say, hey, it wasn't answered. Can you please, you know, give us your thoughts on it relative to this particular point? So it may have to wait to, you know, be on the agenda. Again, it's only fair.
Okay, well, if you don't mind, can we go through this list? Then
No.
there's the video, people who are butters can, no?
I think that'd be very inappropriate. And you know, again, if you had a general question about an interpretation of a statute, that's something else like that. If it's of an ordinance, we can possibly, and if you phrase it in such a way that it's a general consultation, I think, you know, we are more than happy to maybe address it.
Well, I guess, what is your interpretation of the new change in the ordinance from March relative to ADUs? There was a change in the language.
March of
2026.
2026.
You know, this last March, the voters in the town made changed the shall to a may.
Yeah.
What is your interpretation of that statute, and can ADUs be used for this purpose, given this zoning change?
Right. I just asked for the record, whatever this purpose is, can.
Okay. Full-
Because
full-
we're not
Yep.
mingling this with the other, so if you could just
Okay.
tell us
So
what purpose.
sure, can ADUs, where it was shall, the language said shall be deemed a residence of workforce housing, it is now may be deemed a unit of workforce housing in the right, in the ordinance. Can ADUs be used for affordable housing, since workforce housing is a subset of affordable housing?
Okay. I'm going to take a shot at this, and I'm
Okay.
not an attorney, so realize this is my own interpretation. If we go back to the definition of ADUs, if I have if my memory's working here, you know, an ADU, you know, even by its own term, you know, accessory, is subordinate to the actual residence.
Mhm.
So, you know, that's the premise kind of on which I personally look at this. It's not, you know, opinion of the board, and others are more than welcome to kick in here. So, you know, as far as counting it
Yep.
towards a fair share or anything else like this, it's a count. It doesn't mean it supersedes, you know, anything else within our ordinances or changes, you know, our perspective relative to it. But that's mine, and anybody else who wishes to kind of speak to it is more than welcome to. But ADUs are subordinate to the actual residence. So if you're talking about workforce housing, if the principal residence is workforce housing, that type of deal, then that's a different question. And then that may be something that, you know, that qualifies for additional pieces.
I think the bigger question, it's not that I think the statute or the board is disagreeing ADUs being used towards workforce housing, you know, if it meets the requirements. I think the biggest question is looking at the conservation subdivision ordinance, is an ADU qualifying as affordable housing allow you to have X,
5%.
The density bonus.
Yes.
Because
it will, does it have to be the principal primary structure? And I think that's the main question.
Well, and that's where I get the, you know, from my own personal interpretation is subordinate to. So therefore it doesn't rise to the level, but that's just my opinion.
okay,
Mm.
Okay.
Can I just ask you a question, Mr. Chair? I'm not sure I understand, when you say that it's subordinate to and does not rise to the level, are you saying that, while we say an ADU may be deemed a unit of workforce housing for purposes satisfying the municipality's regional fair share obligations, are you,
He's saying yes, he said.
well, yeah, I think that statement is understandable in and of itself, but are you saying that, I think the question on the table is like whether it can then count towards the
Density.
density bonus in the
Yeah.
conservation subdivision.
And my opinion is that it cannot.
It seems to me if the state says it will qualify for the town's
To count.
requirement to count, why wouldn't it count here?
No, he's saying it will count as fair share housing. But when you look at the conservation subdivision ordinance,
Yeah,
Will
will it count as a bonus? of
yeah,
25?
oh, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, but
It-
the issue is, how does it count?
Yep.
You know, and if the state is gonna count it, you know, even though there's a house that it's subordinate to is not workforce housing, but it's gonna count. If someone has an ADU, it's gonna count that that's a unit of workforce housing in the town. It's gonna, the state is gonna count it.
For the
Why
purpose.
wouldn't we count?
I have a
Well-
clarifying question. We seem to be using both workforce housing and affordable housing, and as I understand, they're two
Correct.
different things.
There's
So
two
which
different
one are we
things.
referring to right now? Just so I can follow along as well.
One's a subordinate.
Right, so workforce housing is a more financially constrained rental agreement than affordable, right? Affordable could be up to 120% of the average median salary for Merrimack County, where workforce housing, I think, is capped at 60, if I recall.
rental units.
But
For rental units. And then given RSA 474, or sorry, 674-17, right? Senior housing counts as workforce housing, and senior housing is called out in the subdivision or in the division regulations for bonus.
I think it's affordable housing, senior housing versus affordable housing is
the ordinance, the
ordinance.
conservation subdivision ordinance is the only ordinance I think that's applicable here
Yeah.
in some respects.
Yep.
It's the conservation subdivision ordinance does not mention workforce housing. It mentions affordable housing and senior housing.
Right.
Senior could be somebody making 500,000 a year, but they live in 55 and older or whatever it is. And then affordable housing, meeting the affordable housing criteria, I assume in our ordinance
Right.
if the statute is more restrictive, then it would have to be the statute. I think what Mike was saying, and I'm just wanting to make it clear, is you're getting 2 units rather than 1 bonus unit. And that's why he's getting an ADU unit and an extra primary unit. And so the question is, can you have a primary unit and an ADU unit? Or should the primary unit be considered the affordable housing? Because they're actually allowed, if you give them 1 density bonus, one, they're getting 2.
It's a double hit as opposed to a single
And at the time the ordinance was written, there was not conservation ordinance, there were no ADUs. So I'm saying it wasn't contemplated. I'm not saying it shouldn't be contemplated. I'm just trying to clarify.
I'm just going from what I interpret the ordinance as to reflect. It
But-
has nothing to do with whether I believe or don't believe something should be applied.
Hmm.
And that's something that we may have to clear up, and potentially have an amendment to the zoning ordinances for.
Yeah.
For the future.
Yep.
So
So for anybody else wanna,
Does anybody else?
kick in and wanna on this? That's,
I think the purpose of the ADU for either affordable or senior is to help what we call it, the fair share obligation, right? That calculation.
Mhm.
I don't think it's to expand the number of lots you have in the development. I don't think that's the intent. Whether the ordinance says that or not, we have to take it under advisement, but I don't think that's the intent.
I mean, the project as conceived and discussed last time, right, does end up with 20% of the total number of units at the
we're
end.
not gonna discuss the application.
Okay. And I'm trying to find out because we're stalled moving forward because the design for right, I don't even know that we have agreement on the yield numbers. I believe we do, but I wouldn't hear.
JR, I think they're trying to answer your question. So, I guess you take away from it what the majority opinion is, and that's probably the best legally we can do without it.
Without getting our attorneys involved in giving us,
Okay.
So if,
It does feel hard to make a definitive answer when ADUs are not mentioned explicitly in it. And when an ADU is subordinate to a larger, then saying that it by itself qualifies
Sure.
when it's not, it would never exist on its own.
Okay.
It is one part of a whole in my reading of it. So I'm mindful of that an ADU would never stand alone. It is part of one whole.
I mean, I guess that leaves us with, we come back with these questions for another preliminary review.
or take what they are advising you and run, whatever you feel is appropriate. Does
I mean-
anybody else?
okay?
I am curious from a procedure standpoint. I know we didn't have Karen last time, is if you felt that you had walked out and were expecting answers to
Mhm.
open questions, I don't remember that being clearly communicated. And I don't see it in the notes that we had like next steps to follow up on certain questions. I
Right.
thought it was more like, you're gonna marinate and then you'll schedule more time with us as needed, but I could be misunderstanding
So
last meeting.
just at the beginning, right, it was clear, and this is stated in the zoning ordinance in the preliminary review, that there is no permanent or final decisions made. There's no binding decisions made. That's a little bit atypical for towns, not by itself. So other towns have it, but a lot of towns at the preliminary review finalize certain elements of the design because it does impact the architecture of the layout. So number of lots is a good example of what would be finalized maybe in a preliminary layout, but not in a final because, well, no, that plan doesn't work. We got to go back and do this one more time on a final. So I was caught off guard when that started. I'm okay with that discussion, but it does fundamentally change the project. If we're trying to do a 6-lot, and at that point it could be 6 lots with 6 ADU, right? 6 homes and 6 ADUs, and you have 12 houses, or it could be this. And I'm trying to get to, right, I can meet the zoning ordinances as they were designed originally under the conventional subdivision for 6 lots. So do we pursue that, which is option 1, or do we pursue this conservation subdivision? I'm trying to find clarity to that because it is 2 completely different engineering projects. So I guess
We really can't answer that this evening.
I understand. So I think, is it best that I just put this on hold and we postpone this and come back and list the same questions at the next meeting?
That's up to you. That's up to you.
Could I ask, would we be able to answer those questions in a properly noticed and scheduled conceptual review? Or does it have to be like a fully engineered, like engineer it and?
No, it could be preliminary, but again, it's advisory and legally, it's not a decision. So no, there wouldn't be motions or anything. Again, it would be similar to this, sitting around the table. And
Right.
Mr. Hole would have to, listen to everybody and then go back and make a decision.
Again,
Or do we pursue going and putting together a design, pay to have all the engineering done, come back in and present you something. And then at that point, we're discussing something very similar to the preliminary plans. There was a fair amount of detail in the preliminary plans, but we hadn't done the test bits. There was a bunch of things that were asked for that would be in a final submission.
I would recommend, there's already 3 opinions.
Mhm.
They're basically the same, leaning towards the same. If we could get 1 or 2 more opinions, I think your answer, is,
So to be perfectly clear, the question that you're looking for an opinion on is whether the ADUs should be able to count towards the density bonus.
Right.
correct in general terms. Yes. Meaning not.
So without committing
And
the
state
main,
law Should do that.
So, for example, he'll get 6 units if he, under conservation subdivision ordinance, if you make a unit affordable or senior housing, you can have that 1 extra unit. What I had indicated is that under the current conservation subdivision ordinance, there were no ADUs. The state didn't have statutory provisions with regards to ADUs, so ADUs weren't contemplated. So the ADU is allowed anyways without the bonus. So the question is, and what I asked Mr. Holt to come in and eventually at one point find out, is the ADU will require, count as the density bonus? Or does it have to be the principal primary residence?
So I'm just gonna make one modification. We don't know what the intent was or whether this was
No,
part of
that's
the
why I brought it out.
original, and the original may have included it and it
It
may have,
did not include an ADU because there weren't ADUs then.
right.
So it was originally a primary structure, 1 primary structure. So the question is, he will get 6 primary structures, 6 ADUs, because they're allowed by law. So if he takes one of those ADUs and makes it an affordable unit, does he allowed to have an extra unit? Or does it have to be the principal primary unit that's converted to the ADU?
I've said it and, it's just my opinion, the
because you,
definition says subordinate.
because you can't sell them separately.
No, you can't sell.
So that's what's kind of boggling my mind, is that they are tied together. And so it's like saying, oh, I'm taking a quarter of this piece and making it affordable, but not the other 3/4, right? Because of the sizing and the way they all interact. And so that's where my mind is like getting a little bit stuck as I think
No, I
about.
understand that. And whereas 2 out of the 6 is 33% of the units would have affordable at the concept level, the final yield is still 20%, 2 out of the 10, right?
Are you talking about the primary or the ADU?
2 ADUs plus 8 houses means 10 residential units.
Oh, see, but in my mind,
Right.
the ADU and the house go together, like inseparable. And so in my mind, barring there being something that says the word ADU in here, I'm
Yep.
considering it lot by lot.
Okay.
And so you're saying like a percentage of a lot is going to be
I see. Okay.
affordable housing. And this is just, again, without there being ADU in it, it's hard to.
Okay.
But that's my initial opinion, is taking a percentage of it doesn't quite get us there.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? When you have the, let's just call it the permanent structure on the lot and you build an ADU, are you selling that as one property?
That's one
Yes.
property.
Right? So if I buy the permanent resident,
Right.
am I buying this too? And I have the option of renting it or?
Yes.
Yeah, you bought, so it.
So you're
bought
buying
the
the whole-
one, it can't be subdivided. Those cannot be turned into 2 separate,
Correct.
right? Real estate transactions. Someone buys the property and has the ADU. Now, the owner may be 55 and buys the property and lives in the ADU and rents out the house. That is a viable option. They may buy and let their kids rent in the house if their kids are in the income bracket.
How does it qualify as affordable or senior housing if someone under the age of 50 rents the?
Yeah, no, they would have to be over 55 to buy, if they bought the
To buy
property.
to buy the group together.
Yes,
You have to, somebody over 55 would have to buy the permanent resident plus the ADU
yes,
to qualify as senior or something.
right.
Why
If
would-
they
why
want to
would
live
that
in
be?
if the owner wanted to live in the ADU,
Yeah, but I mean, if the owner is 20 years old, wants to buy primary, live in the primary, and have somebody that's senior age live
They can
in,
do that.
okay, they don't have to be 55 to buy the property.
Right.
This is not a question for him, but how do we even
No, but
enforce that?
you're qualifying the ADU as a
Yeah.
affordable housing or senior housing alternative, right? For the fair share calculation.
Right.
But you're not buying it. You don't have to buy it like that as a unit when you purchase it. You purchase it with the main house. I feel like we're just kind of mixing it together there.
Well, you would have to buy it, and somebody else speak up, please. But you would have to buy it as an affordable or senior housing for in this scenario, the ADU, commit to it,
Uh-huh.
and the primary could be used by anyone. Again, I go back to the question. The ADU is allowed anyways,
Right.
Right.
so it's not
But I'm trying to tie it back to
I
the
think
density
you're-
bonus. So if I buy
don't-
it, if you buy it, you have to commit it to the ADU being a senior housing option
correct.
when you buy it.
That would be part of the
It'd be on the
deed.
deed.
That would be that would be part of the sales agreement.
Yeah.
It would be part of
It'd
the
be on the
deed.
deed.
It would be on the deed and it
correct.
would be an annual compliance measure that's part of the homeowner association that was discussed at the last time.
I think the difficulty here is that I think if the state allows you to count it, that we should too. But I think the difficulty here is it's not in our ordinance. It's not specifically there because we didn't have ADUs back then.
That's why I'm happy.
And I think that's why this is a kettle of, fine kettle.
I think the language should-
Count it towards what?
towards the fair share.
Quota for workforce housing.
Yeah, but if it-
Affordable
Fair
housing.
share, fair share.
Non-fair share quota,
Right.
but that is separate from the conservation subdivision
Right.
and the intent of the conservation subdivision. And I don't think that this particular view of the question
Right.
has been addressed yet
Okay.
at any of our meetings. But I will say Alyssa has encapsulated how I feel here. We're talking about lots.
Yep.
And structures on lots.
Okay.
And so adding lots, because the percentage of the structure on a lot has been designated, is tough for me without any legal understanding
Mhm.
of the, interpretation, as well as if there's precedent for that. I have no idea.
I think I can provide my 2 cents here. I guess I think I agree with Jane. I mean, I have a hard time seeing how we would say to the state, this is a housing unit and should help us meet our quota or our, fair share requirement. And then turn around and say to the builder, but it's not actually a housing unit for our purposes. I mean, in my neighborhood, we just had a 2,200 square foot single family home sell to a woman who lives alone, and she's a wonderful person, and we're glad to have her in the neighborhood. But she probably, if she had other options like a smaller and more sort of affordable and manageable property, she might have chosen that, and that home might have been sold to, somebody else who needed the space. And so I do struggle with sort of the practical implementation, and I think, the deed restriction is the way that it would be done, and so it's just because it's new doesn't mean it's impossible, but it's, I think we as a board would have to get our heads around exactly how that.
Why not
Work.
commit the whole lot?
That is an option, right? Right, you could have 2 deeded lots in the latest plan, right? There's 2 that have ADUs. You could have those deeded lots where the primary lot
Yeah.
and the ADU, right? And now you have 4. And as the ordinance has changed, so has statutes in real time. You guys are doing your best to keep up, right? ADUs for the first time became shall be allowed type level language at the state level. That changes things. So now everybody can have an ADU on their property. One option to go forward for us would be build 6 lots with 6 ADUs. I didn't think that was the best use, and just do a conventional subdivision. I thought about the land. I looked at it when we were reviewing it. I thought the conservation subdivision made sense. And to put in a paved road is an expensive portion of this. You guys have asked, not you, but the departments have asked for a paved road. There's another $150,000 or $130,000 in paving costs, not just build road. That's just on top of the, so we came in and asked whether we could count the ADUs toward the fair share and use this and have 8 lots, and then there would be a total of 10 residential units at the end. 2 of those would be ADUs tied to lots, and there would be 6 without.
May I ask one more question? It's the ordinance, the conservation subdivision ordinance indicates affordable housing or senior housing.
Right.
Senior housing is not necessarily affordable housing or workforce housing.
Right.
So you've got Riverwoods and all these places that are extremely expensive. Why would you, just asking in general terms, why would you do affordable housing? Wouldn't it be easier to sell if you did senior housing?
Like just do 2 units of senior housing been done, and that is, so there are other options. I guess the question, right? So hypothetically, you could take the plan that we talked about last time.
We're not gonna.
I know, no, I'm just,
A little worried here that we have gone way past and talking about the application without appropriate notice and input from the public.
Right.
And so I think you've heard
As much as you're gonna hear.
it from the group here, and you have options,
Okay.
and that's gonna be your call
right.
on what you bring forth, whether you ask for another preliminary.
Okay.
Yeah, or you bring in a full application and
Okay.
start working towards, acceptance or, disapproval associated with that application.
Okay.
And, um,
In the meantime, separate from this application, is it worth us as a board getting clarity from our own legal counsel in the event this comes up again in the future before we address it in our own ordinance?
depends what he comes forth with, and
Oh, I don't
No,
think
in
you can.
general.
No, in
In
general,
general.
right? Because this is because of the recent changes at state law have impacted the zoning ordinance in a way, and
I don't want to ask legal about his. I wanna
yeah,
ask
no,
English.
I get it. And that's why I'm asking questions.
well, it's not just our ordinance, it's what does the RSA itself interpret itself to be? Because, there's a may in there, there's a shall, but it says counting towards, it doesn't say anything else. So I think, what was the intent of the statute? They may have to go back to the additional presentation in the hearings to understand what the real intent of that provision. I mean, it's like fair share. If you don't meet your fair share, what's the penalty to the town of Hopkinton? There isn't. It's a counting mechanism associated with it, with the intent. I know what the intent is, is to get as many houses, or units available to individuals for which to be able to live in.
And
That's a
transparently
great,
coming
great
out of the
initiative.
housing opportunity proposal, right? That whole project that went over the last 2 years. One of the informal recommendations from the consultancy was that we basically had to scrap that entire section and start over because it was unworkable. It was hard for developers to work through. It was impossible for us to enforce. And not that I'm proposing that in any way, shape, or form, but I'm just naming everything you're saying, the complications there and how to even, you can't enforce it. There's no mechanisms. There's no penalty if you don't do it.
Alyssa, are you referring to affordable housing or conservation subdivision?
Affordable housing.
Oh,
No, he did not say to scrap the conservation subdivision. That's not
Well,
what he said.
we have a lot of things that are out there that are very, very complicated.
Mhm.
That, were passed on their own merit. Some of them partially integrate with it, like the affordable housing and workforce housing. And I don't know the answer.
Right.
I just,
And I'm doing my best to try and understand the wishes of the board here. And if the board, and I'm sensing the board doesn't feel that ADUs count toward the density bonus, which means the other options on the table are you designate 2 lots to be senior housing out of that division, and then you meet the requirements without asking for any variance. There are other approaches. One other approach would be to 6 lots and with ADUs. I got to work out the business plan side of this because we did commit, and I want to keep that commitment relative to paving the road, which was asked for by DPW. And we just got to make sure that that makes sense.
and you're not required to pave the road. If it's 5 lots with 5 ADUs, you're not required to. Under the,
you have options.
Right,
you know.
yep.
And no.
just
Uh,
abide by the ordinance. Of
Right.
Thank you. And if you want it, what's the deadline if he wants to put the application in for next month?
Friday.
Yeah, it's this week. So,
Okay.
okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. We do have a notice of voluntary merger. Uh, some of you may know the individual. That's come before us.
That against.
And the process here is that we just have to recognize that it's been submitted, Karen.
Yes.
And so a vote to recognize its submission is necessary.
And then I think I highlighted for you, if there is a motion, the fact that it meets the requirements of 67439A or something like that.
67439A, right? Is there anybody that wishes to recuse themselves from the session?
I do. Well, I can answer questions if you like.
Okay. So it's on the table. If folks want to, review it and ask any questions.
So we need a motion to say that we reviewed it.
You reviewed it and it complies,
And it
with
complies with
7430, 39A.
39A. I make a motion that we admit that it's been
Okay.
admitted before us and we've looked at it and it complies with 674:39A.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Seeing none? It has been accepted.
But don't try and subdivide it again.
It was joined at once. It was subdivided. I'm putting it back together. That's all I'm doing.
You never know.
And Dean, would you like to come back to the board?
You're coming back to join the board?
Yes.
He's thinking about it.
Yes,
Thinking about it.
thank you.
I don't blame you. Okay. Planning board work plan for 2026. Karen,
So,
you are the lead here.
yep, there are two items, and let me see if I can find my other copy, I apologize. I would like to start with I'll start with the shortest thing. Jack Ruderman, Chair of the Housing Committee, did as requested. He submitted a memo, which I provided to you this evening, with the 3 items that will go on the work plan. And then if you get a chance when you get an opportunity to read through it, it'll talk about pros, cons, and so on and so forth. Jack, I suggested he not come to this meeting for 2 reasons. One, he wasn't on the agenda, and 2, it gives the board an opportunity to review the memo. And so what he will do is come to the June meeting and answer any questions you may have early in the stage, the process, I should say. Then the second item on the work plan is, on the work plan, you added the conservation subdivision ordinance. And my memo to you dated February 20th. I'm trying to obtain some guidance with respect to revisions and how you feel before I draft some revisions or review other communities and see how they handle certain situations. So in particular, the density and determination, I think Sam had brought it up previously, and maybe some others, that instead of requiring the yield plan, do a formula approach, taking out the wetlands and steep slopes and so on and so forth, whatever you have left, calculate that by the minimum lot size, and that'll be your number. And I just want to get a consensus of how the board would like to proceed.
Is that for the conservation ordinance changes?
Correct. If that's the approach you would like me to take. I do want to add, though, a lot of people you hear that aren't familiar with development firsthand will indicate that the yield plan costs the developer money. I've spoken to so many of them. I spoke to one person who just did the golf course for 20-something units in Dumbarton and others, they've already done the yield plan for themselves if they're spending that much money. They already know about wetlands, so it is not as cumbersome as the non-builders think it is, or non-developers. But it is a simpler approach to use the formula approach than to, you know, probably timing would be a key thing. If we want to make this easier, or I should say quicker, you may want to go with the formula approach.
You know, from the, just my thought, from the couple of opportunities we saw with the conservation, you know, ordinance. I always look at conservation land as not, that is usable by the public. And it seems like, to me, at least what we get sometimes is wetland or more property that, yes, it's conservation land, but it's not necessarily, you know,
Yeah.
great public land, like public use land, you know what I'm saying? Like not hiking trails or things that, you know, sort of benefit everybody. It's like they put and I'm not being critical, I'm just saying, like, you put the land you couldn't even never build on anyway in conservation as part of making the requirement to get you extra lots. Well, that's not the intent, I think, what we were trying to do, is it? Or am I
Well, I think
misunderstanding that?
the way it's written, and I'll give you a good example, Hopkins Green, Whitetail Run, those are privately owned conservation places, and you're allowed to do that, where overall what you're doing is preserving open space. Who owns it? The way the ordinance is written, it isn't an issue. If that's the approach the board wants to take, definitely let me know, and we will work that into any revisions. But it can be owned by the owners within the development, and they can prohibit the public from using it.
They could use it for its own good, but if we go back to the definition of open space, it really was established, again, my memory is failing as I get older, was
I'll tell you if you're wrong.
okay, was really to make sure to be able to provide wildlife corridors.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
these wildlife corridors, you know, and there were some writings, if I recall, you know, trails and you know, various things like that. So I lump it in my mind as value. What's the value associated with that open space for
Right.
wildlife, for
Don't
trails?
misunderstand. I'm all for conservation. I would just like to see it be quality than just,
Have value.
yes, somewhere.
So the way the ordinance is written, in some communities are a little different on this number. 50%, you have the total acreage of the parcel before development. 50% of that parcel must go in conservation or open space. Of the 50%, that acreage, half of that acreage can be wetlands, steep slopes, poor property, but the other half must be upland. So it's 50%. Some communities put 40%. I haven't seen much lower than 40%. But again, half of that land can be, you know,
Steep slope.
steep slopes.
That's because if it's not at least, or somewhere around 50%, that maybe the idea of conservation never takes hold. Is that why
Well-
it's not 100% or something greater than 50?
No, I think conservation is wetlands. And so I think that they're looking at it as the importance of wetlands, the preservation of the aquatic, you know, I'm going to call them animals, but I know they're not, that live in these wetlands. And so I think that they looked at it as not, I may have used the word poor property, but not poor property. But in order to be enticing to the developer, that property also can be counted as your open space, but no more than 50%.
One of the things, you know, that bothers me is also the stress of the word contiguous. You know, that, you know, the open space can't be splattered all over the place.
That may be something
Yes.
if you are agreeable, that may be something that you want to address.
I looked at the state statute not too long ago, before the preliminary application came in here. And there is a summary of if I remember correctly, that it be contiguous, but it's not in the statute itself. So I was a little bit,
Mhm.
lost as to, okay, on one hand, it's described as being to be contiguous and then it didn't appear. So I don't know. At least I didn't see it.
It always seemed to me, when we were talking about cluster development, was the name of this stuff before we made it conservation. Which I think was just a verbal, more acceptable word than cluster. But it was a way to develop the land in such a way that we got more development. We got some more houses for people to live in, but we didn't see it like like, a bunch of houses along the road, like the one that was on Barrington Corners that, got 7 houses there. It was just like it was just like a standard development with the right, but it didn't need as much road frontage because it was a conservation subdivision.
They were giving open space, correct?
Yeah, and so that they got more houses along the road, and that looks a lot more developy than if you have a road that goes in and then they're all there and there's open space all around and up to the road, and you don't really see them like Hopkins Green.
We're touching on a lot of different topics, and the question Karen asked was whether we wanted to do a formula or a yield plan. And I feel like there's a sort of, we're sort of,
We got
Was it-
away from that, yes.
yeah. So can we
It-
refocus
Well,
on Karen's
well,
question?
the other thing I have thought about this conservation, when you talk about the standard number of houses, and then you try and make the formula, have it come out just close to the standard. Do you know that it didn't seem to me like you got any, that the conservation stuff doesn't give them very much incentive. This man is trying to use the incentives, the few incentives we have. He's trying to use them so he can afford to build the road and, and make a profit. It seems to me when you use, it doesn't matter whether you use the layout one or the computation one, if you're trying to come out to the same spot.
Well, that's the thing that I wonder in my mind, and we haven't had enough of them that even if we wanted to, that we could get it compared. In other words, if you use a yield plan as opposed to a formula on the same property, what's the result come out to be? And it's going to vary by property because of what's there and what's not
The
there.
shape and whatever.
Yeah, and with the waterways and everything else like that. So I kind of wonder. I don't know the difference. I don't, I don't have a comparative analysis in my mind to say that one is better than the other.
I
I think like we can have a different.
It seemed easier, but.
Yeah, I think like there's two different conversations to have, and one is sort of how stringent or generous do we want to be in terms of incentives, and how many houses do we want to allow, and then there's a different one about just like what is the process, and so we could choose either process and then be either very generous with density bonuses and things like that, or very, very stringent and allow nothing. I feel like we should try to answer Karen's question about which process and which way of administering the ordinance is better.
And I'm only right at this moment asking this one thing so that I can start writing something and know what approach to take.
Just an example question to help me understand the difference. For the gentleman that was just in front of us, if hypothetically, if we had done the other method, what would be different about his proposal?
In a perfect world, it should be the same. You do the formula at the bottom of this memo that I've got for you, and he should come out to about the same number of units. And then he can still apply for a density bonus and, all that stuff. It shouldn't change. We used to have the formula approach. And we did a lot of work on
Mhm.
the formula approach where we ran a number of scenarios to find out, hey, we want to make sure they get the same number of lots as conventional, even if they get one extra, that's fine. But we just want to make sure they did not were not negatively affected by getting less.
So why did we, if we had done formula in the past, why did we go to yield?
Yes, I had recommended that you go back to the old yield plan because the formula approach was so complicated. You had to divide it by 120,000 square feet.
Yeah,
which
you couldn't understand it.
was hypothetically your road and utility area and so on.
Okay.
I think this approach, which was recommended at one point in our master plan by the Regional Planning Commission, this approach is much easier. But I mean, I'd get developers call me and they'd be like, divide that by this and 100, what's the 120,000 square feet?
And so just to make sure I'm following along, we used to have a formula. The formula was very complicated.
Complicated.
Switch to yield, cool,
That-
but intimidating. Even though it's not expensive, the process can feel intimidating until you're in it. And now we have a simpler formula or a more accessible formula that would make the process of working with us seem less cumbersome.
I
And
believe
so if we wanted to continue to encourage folks to come work with us, the newest formula would be one small change we could make.
My opinion is yes.
Okay, thank you. Just trying to make sure I actually understood, besides like the lovely things you wrote in there about like, but I was like, no, like what's the narrative underneath
Yeah,
that I'm
no.
missing? Okay.
And I always give more information than you want.
Well, no, it was great, but I'm like, no, there's a history here I'm not catching.
I want to say underneath it all, we are using the land in the same way.
Yes.
And that's what I think may be a problem. That zoning requires you to use this land in the same way, and you're not gonna get more houses, you're not gonna get more.
No, but you get shorter roads, less costs, shorter
That's-
infrastructure to pay for.
Yes, that would.
In exchange, because your frontage is shorter, in exchange, you're giving up 50% of the land. So instead of
But-
paying them a fee, they're not going to have to do 1,000-foot road. Instead, they may have to do a 500-foot road.
But yes, the people who make out by this are the homeowners. Because then they don't have so much acreage to
To
pay
pay for.
taxes on. So we're cutting us off a little. It's like letting people give up half their land to go to some conservation easement. And now they only have to pay half of the property taxes on their land because they've given the rest of the land to 5 Rivers or to the town or to whatever. And I mean, the bottom line is we need more houses. And you gotta have more land if you need more houses, and you're gonna have to use the land more heavily if you're gonna put more houses on it. And this, it doesn't seem to me that either way our plan is to, no, we don't want to change. We don't want to have more houses. We want the same. We want the rural atmosphere of our town. And I'm just throwing this out as a concern. I mean, here I am. I just built an ADU, didn't have to buy any land at all. And it still cost an arm and a leg to build a house. So I don't know. I'm just throwing out my concerns that we're not using our land well enough to make it good for people to have more affordable houses or at least be able to have more houses.
Jane, I believe incentivizing the conservation approach where it's a community together, open space preservation for wildlife habitat and so on and so forth. But I also think reducing the cost of construction, whether it be by allowing more units or by allowing an unpaved road or by allowing a private road, those are
Yeah,
avenues in which we're going to be able to keep the cost of housing down. You know, there are a number of approaches we could take.
To the property tax, oh, Molly, go ahead.
I think one, we want the rural town too. That is a top
yeah,
priority
I-
on everybody's
I
survey,
agree.
every time.
Yeah, every time.
But also my feeling on yield plan versus formula is based on the last three applications that have come before us, the yield plan is confusing. Everyone sees the yield plan and says, I was okay with the yield plan, and I'm real talking about
The
abutters
butters.
or other taxpayers in the general vicinity of the new development. We've had that same comment come up each time. This yield plan looks great. I want this. And then it just changed dramatically to
The conservation.
Plan B, and I don't like this anymore. And what happened? And why isn't the planning board just accepting the other one?
Uh-huh.
And, you know, obviously that's a discussion you can have.
Yeah.
For understanding, but I don't really care for the yield plan, to be honest with you, in the case of the conservation subdivision, because it will change.
Mhm.
It will not be the final development. And so when that goes out and people see that, and I'm assuming that goes in the abutter package
does.
too, and they're like, hey, this, you know, I don't want this, but it looks okay. I can deal with this private road and.
And then they say all those driveways right on the intersection.
And
Yes.
they don't realize
So-
that the yield plan is just to prove the number of units you can, or lots you can get under conservation. That's its only purpose. And then they, like you said, I think based on the last couple subdivisions, the abutters seem confused because they're not aware of that, nor should they be.
Mhm.
And
I
so,
think they're getting 5 and the builder's going for 7 or 8.
Correct.
And so, and to your point, on Sugar Hill, they put all those across the front of the road, which nobody wanted any of that. And we're left here trying to figure out how we help anybody.
But how does the formula approach address any of the concerns? Just to make sure I understand. So with the formula approach, would it be that the number it's going to be is much more transparent from the beginning as opposed to you start with one number that migrates to another?
Well, I think what I'm saying is you're not getting a visual that looks like Hopkins Green and, you know, winding up with a completely different plan that is perfectly acceptable and will be accepted by the board because it meets all of the requirements.
Yeah, I
So you're
agree.
starting, and it's the visual for me. I appreciate the
think it's relevant
process.
for
I get
everybody,
it.
Yeah.
The
But it's
public-
just, I don't, you know.
So it's that the yield plan comes with a visual and the formula does not.
correct. And the public sees or abutters see the visual. And while the applicant and the board understands what the yield plan's purpose is, the public seems to be, well, how come they're allowed to have more units? Why did you allow them? Here's this plan. And they didn't realize throughout the whole process, that's just to show they can get that many units.
But you have to be sure that with the formula,
Mhm.
and I agree, it's a lot simpler. It's for the average person, even for us. It's a heck of a lot simpler. But you're also relying on trust.
Definitely.
And so if somebody comes in here and says, oh, this is how many units I can put in there, let's go, and here's the application. Planning board, oh, it looks great, we're going to approve it. And if we step back and after the fact and we ask them to lay it all out for us, we find out, oh my God, we allowed 3 more houses.
Mhm.
Well, can't we require them to provide some documentation that they have 147,000 square feet of upland, you know, non-steep?
Well, we'll be on,
They still have to, you have to go out there and you have to, as Karen said before, when they're going to be developing a particular lot, they have to have all that information to begin with. So why not show it to us?
well, because I already thought of that too, because what will happen is they'll come in and say, I can get 10 lots.
This would have been 12.
But we don't know if, then they map it out as 10 lots conservation. We're not sitting there like, okay, there's, you know, out of 100 acres, 32 acres is wetland, you know, we're not, you know, all that stuff. I think we're trusting them that indeed there's 10 lots you can get.
Wasn't one of the last couple of ones we had was previously approved for 5? And now it's either one of the last 2 presentations, or maybe this one?
I don't know
It
that
was
that was
approved
the
for
concept.
5 years ago, right? And now it's coming in, now it's coming in at 8. right?
That one.
That was the
So
one
when they
on-
remapped the wetlands,
After
they
the
found the
square.
wetlands, some of the wetlands
Four
by a
corners.
different wetland scientist were no longer really wetlands. So therefore they have
That's
more
depressing.
upland area and could get 6 lots instead of 5.
Yeah,
They did
but,
two more
but
with the
my-
density.
but you're saying about the visual and the change, but that's true, and I think that's a problem. But if they're just showing us the one with with a formula and the way it's gonna be, it's gonna look just as ugly as it looked. They didn't see the better looking one, but the one that we get, our ordinance allows them enough flexibility to put the houses all on the street and then all the
That's what I-
open spaces in the back. Great for animals, maybe. I care about the animals, but it's
So long as our ordinance allows it.
allowed it,
I
yes.
actually think, again, appreciating what the purpose of the yield plan is. I do understand that, but so long as the ordinance allows the secondary
Yes.
plan with the incentives, et cetera, I feel like that is what the public should be working with to understand this is what's gonna happen. You saw this really pretty looking diagram that had 5 houses, 6 houses on it, but now there are going to be,
10.
yeah. And-
So can't we say like, yes, formula to Karen, but, and I assume this is why it was already on the work plan, but then come back and address all the concerns y'all are raising that have nothing to do with the actual formula, but have to do with the ordinance itself and how do we update the language? So like we can give Karen the like, yes, no on the yield and formula, but then also clearly carve out.
Yes,
Time
I know.
to address.
Yeah.
Change the ordinance.
And I have no problem if the developer still has to submit a yield plan, but I'm not sure why the actual plan that they wish to dig the dirt for is not what is actually going out to the abutters. And I
Well,
probably
they both
did,
are. They-
but I think it's viewed as an either or. And
Yes.
it's just a decision that the planning board can make. Which one do we like better meets the, and that's not really the way.
It is.
Both plans go out to the abutter, 11
And
by
is that
17.
a legal requirement?
No,
or-
we, in an effort to try to be as transparent and helpful as
I'm
possible.
with that.
The only thing that's required to be sent to them is the notice of public hearing, the notice. But I've always sent, hey, here's the plan, and, one will say yield plan, one will say conservation subdivision, will say with the title, and then they'll come and eventually wonder, how come they're not using this plan and this, not knowing how it works, similar to what we had last time.
Maybe it's presentation and, you have to provide supporting documentation as to what it would be. And maybe that's how it gets laid out, it gets communicated, I don't know. But remember, what are the concerns I have, if somebody comes in here with a dozen houses. And we sit there and look at the property and we say, no way. We're gonna have to hire a consultant to go out there and perform the same activity that we would have done.
If we don't believe them, we can't ask them to provide.
Well, they'd pay for it, but I mean, it's still the delay. I mean, now it's still one more step.
It's still simpler. I don't know. I mean, for the reasons I'm always stated, I think that the formula is a better approach. And then I agree with Alyssa that we should then focus on changing the description of what we want in the actual plan that's going to get built to get better
Well,
outcomes.
the ordinance forces them to make it look like we want it to look.
That is what I would like to achieve, yeah.
That the ordinance is supposed to, that's what it's for. It's to structure it so what we want. And I am sympathetic to the price of housing. But I also think Molly is right. You would have, if you really made big differences in this, how many houses they could put in there and it would be more economical to build little houses because you could have a lot, but if they were off in the woods and you really couldn't see them, sort of like the cell towers. When we change the ordinance to the cell towers, we said we need cell towers. Everybody wants to talk on their phone, but the only thing they don't want to do is see the cell towers. So we made the ordinance so that, nobody can see the 7 or 8 towers that are in this town, except the one that's next to me. But, that's what we would need to do with this ordinance, is make it so we can have a bunch more houses to get our affordable quotas and whatever, but that we don't see them and they're not all lined up on the street and they're not all in your neighbor's backyard, or do you know what I mean?
think I understand what you're saying, but I think that's also kind of
Difficult.
contradictory to the conservation part of it, depending on how you're going to achieve that, carve out that land. But and this might have just been the language you used, Karen, but to the, sort of to the point of the yield plan versus formula, especially with the new buffers, I don't think we should trust any statements on wetlands. I think that should be at least provided by a wetlands expert of some sort, saying this is, you know, the 40% or the 50%
Oh, definitely.
minimum has been met. And we're saying that, and we've had someone who, you know, we're not.
Can I, all right, I think I think I know where I'm going on the question. On page 2, I would recommend, the constrained lands, would include, we are not specific on floodplain and whatnot, so I would suggest if you look at this, whether or not you agree with these items.
You're talking about if the constrained lands would include?
Like when they go do whether they do a formula approach or a yield plan, these are the constrained land areas that they cannot include.
Do these basically match what you can count towards your acreage if you're like
The
building one house?
50%.
What's that?
This is, in the conservation, you can have 50% of this in the open space.
But if I have, if I want to build one house on one lot and I need
This
40,000
doesn't apply.
square feet,
Oh, no,
Right.
that goes under a wetlands section. This is the conservation subdivision ordinance. So they have to come in for a development.
But the constrained lands would include wetlands and surface waters, but that's only up to 50% of the 50%,
Correct.
right? Okay.
It's allowed to be in your
So when you go to do a single family home,
open space.
we said last year, I'm gonna call it last year, but March, we said, hey, you cannot include the minimum lot size. We said, minimum lot size. And then we were, I think something like that. We changed the language and first we said 1 acre or minimum lot size, because some of the minimum lot sizes were less than 1 acre. So they still in the conservation subdivision ordinance cannot include wetlands in the minimum lot size. So
Right.
that is fine. This is for your open space that I'm referring to. This is just, I haven't written anything, but these are the constraints in the 50%, like Molly was just saying.
I remember when we were looking at when we were doing this originally, this ordinance,
Yeah.
and they were showing us pictures of various towns that had various things. And a lot of the houses were little and all close together.
Yeah, I mean,
They were on an acre.
no, and it begs the question, well, if you really want to have more houses and stuff like this, change your frontage, change your lot size, and, you know, you will increase it dramatically here in this town.
So of the 50% that is not upland, okay, or that is, what's another word? Non-usable open space, 50%. These are the items that need to go into that category of non-usable of the open space. So in other words, wetlands and surface waters, right now, they go into that 50% category. If you're in the 100-year floodplain, you can't develop in there anyways, so 50%, you know, so that's
That
why
can be-
what I'm going through.
Yeah. You want to, yeah, they should be included in my.
I'd like to list them is what I'm saying.
Yeah,
I'm not sure about the slopes. That always gets me, the slopes.
well, again, if you're.
They're very hard to build on, Steve,
Yeah, you
and they
can
said,
build on.
I know Tim Burney
They
has said
look
at one
nice.
time that it's so difficult, it's too costly and difficult to get a road on a 25% slope.
Yeah.
But if you want to include it, that's fine.
No, I was saying for your counted as your open space, that they're nice
They
open
can
space.
include it in their open space, but only
But-
in 50% of the open
Yeah.
space. That's what all this stuff can be included in your open space, but only up to 50%.
Yeah.
So if you have 10 acres of open space, only 5 acres can include all these items.
Okay.
can I try writing something similar to this and then just to get
Sure.
you something?
Yeah.
Okay.
Work on.
I would do, so if we took the no yield plan approach, the next line item, I want to look at and see, what other communities do as far as verifying those constraints, we go back to somebody wanting how many acres in wetlands. There might be communities that don't have anything for verification, and there might be communities that have something very simple. It may be a letter stamped by a licensed wetland sign, something much simpler.
To your point earlier, you said that, when somebody's developing the land, they're doing it anyway.
Yeah, so a developer is not gonna spend $500,000 or $1 million on a lot to subdivide if they don't already know they can get that number of
exactly.
units, lots out of it. It's just not worth it to them. So they need to know off right away. They've already consulting most likely a wetland scientist. Somebody's already walked it, a forester or a wetland scientist. They already know the idea of the soil types and the expense and an overview of what it is. I'm just saying the formula approach may streamline the planning board process because they don't have to wait until somebody develops that yield plan. Who knows,
Mhm.
But again, trust but verify.
No, I know. That's why
Uh,
I'd like to look into what that, if other.
Well,
communities-
you mentioned maybe it has to be certified that is going to be it by a wetlands scientist
So,
and.
Maybe when they do that, maybe they submit a letter indicating the number of lots or whatnot. And then maybe the letter needs to be stamped by the surveyor and stamped by a wetlands or scientist.
Just for, this kind of like an actuarial certification needs to come on their letterhead.
Yeah.
So that they're held accountable, not just the stamp, so that there's a signature that in the event we sit there and say, wait a minute here, you're not even close.
Yeah. And it's their license that's on the
Yeah,
line.
yeah,
So
that's
that
why
could-
I'm saying it should be on
could
their,
be
soil certification.
Why don't we suggest the wetlands expert to them, since we don't trust anybody?
they're gonna already hire a wetlands expert and when they do their
Right.
conservation subdivisions. So when they tell us the yield plan approach can be 10 lots, we'll say as part of the planning board process, they submit a letter to us indicating how they came up with the formula or the numbers. At the same time, we can require a letter from the soil scientist, wetland scientist, and a letter from the surveyor, rather than developing this plan, certifying that, what is said in the letter is accurate. They're the licensed individuals, they're the professionals.
Yeah, I mean, assuming the wetlands, there's a certification process we're comfortable with.
Yeah.
Whoever they're using, right?
Right.
Right.
And it's their license, that's
Right.
on the line per se. So,
Okay.
excuse me. Okay.
I'm kicking it. Sorry.
Oh, don't be, it's all right. Okay.
All right, we talked about steep slopes. I gave you an example in the formula, if it was 40 acres and, the two projects that we already did. And they came out to the same number of units if we used the formula approach versus their yield plan. It did come out, Alyssa, to the same number. Okay, I had some policy questions if you want to keep going. Are you happy with the 50% number? The 50% of it must go in open space, or do you want to reduce that number? I've seen 40%. I've not seen anything less than 40.
That comes back to Jane's comment earlier about how much land is going in. So if that is a concern, it sounds like this is the time to talk about it.
When you've seen 40%, is that common or is it mostly 50%?
It's mostly 50%, but I've run across, I think it may not even be here, but I had a spreadsheet, and I don't remember the community, but I could go back and look, and it was 40%. It's mostly 50%.
It seems like a lot of the angst that we've been sensing from the public and maybe some of us is not so much around like, whether it's 40 or 50%,
Mhm.
but what the open space looks like. I guess we'll get to that when we talk contiguous. Is
Yep.
that right?
Yep.
Because I don't really see what it
All right.
matters if we do 40 or 50. I don't have a strong. feeling
Okay.
about that.
All right, how do you feel? Yeah, should the open space be contiguous? Do you?
Is that a yes or no question, or is that like a continuum?
I forgot his name.
Everybody's half of the
Rob-
backyard was gone.
Rob
Sanders.
Robert Sanders,
Oh,
where it was spots of open space. Again, as part of each lot, because the public couldn't get to these open space over private property. Or you can require it to be contiguous. Similar, I'm gonna use Hopkins Green and Wildwood and all them, it's a contiguous piece.
Can we maybe also discuss as part of this specific topic? I'm just curious how people feel about the conservation land being owned individually within the subdivision, meaning I own the conservation land that is associated with my non-contiguous parcel or contiguous parcel. That's my couple of acres. My neighbor owns their couple of acres that is in conservation. And I believe that's the way that subdivision is done, the one that you just referenced. And I'm just curious if that, I know that's in our ordinance, so I understand that. I think that's the only one we have like that in town.
Correct. I don't think it was when I've been here a while and Jane and Mike were here. That wasn't, I can tell you that wasn't the intent.
No.
That's the word I was looking
And I,
for, our intent.
road frontage lots was not the intent. It, again, the model was, I'm gonna use Hopkins Green,
Right.
You got a road in, the buffer is 100 and some odd feet, so you can't see the development from the road. Then you've got this cluster of homes, But the ordinance does not prohibit the frontage lots and,
Uh-huh.
the contiguous opens, you know what I mean?
One of the things about Hopkins Green, and I didn't realize this until last meeting, the meeting before, is that there is open space that surrounds the neighborhood on the outside as well.
Comes all the way down to Hopkinton Road.
All the way down to Hopkinton Road. That's correct. And
On each side of the road in Hopkins Green, and then it goes out and around, and it's maybe a 50-foot strip. It's not 100, and we can talk about that. And then it abuts the trail, Hawthorne Trail. And that is owned again by if there's 10 lots, it's 1/10 of an interest everybody has. And the other unique thing, I think, is I call it an island, the cul-de-sac in the middle.
the green.
Is open space also.
the discussion around the ownership by the individual houses, it's land that is attached to the individual houses, but is it not with the open space that the ownership is not 10%, but the ownership is a collective of the entire development?
If it's in with the individual houses, it's only owned by that one individual house.
So in other words, let's talk about Hopkins Green for a second. That loop that goes all the way around it. So, house number 4 has, 400 feet
589.
of that space that is quote unquote open space. That's
But it's not part of the lot. It's a separate lot.
right. So in theory, since it's accessible and the responsibility of everybody, you're saying it's just responsibility
No.
for maintenance for that one homeowner?
No, you're right. That development, there's no specific space you own of the open space. It's collectively.
Collective.
Yes,
Okay.
you're right.
That's, I just wanted.
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
sorry. And then those that have it as part of their lot, and they just designate the area on the lot, individual lot, they're the ones that actually own that open space.
Are they taxed for it?
There's a method by which, yes, it could be, it's similar to current use formula, it's understood how it works.
The problem we're having here is we're not seeing Hopkins Green's development coming in front of us.
No.
Flat land that look all wooded and looks nice with a cul-de-sac. You're seeing, what we just saw, 50% of it's wetlands. Some wetlands you gotta wear boots on just to walk through part of it, right? And how can I get as many homes as I can in that little area? And so if you try to design it so everything looks like Hopkins Green, you're not gonna get those projects.
No, but I'm just saying at the time that
No, I,
was,
no, I get it. I
Yeah.
think it's great. I wish we had a bunch like that, but we don't.
And I can appreciate the conservation just as wildlife protection,
Mhm.
wetland protection,
Mhm.
as a conservation goal. Sometimes there's been at least one project for the conscom where the land was specifically pointed out in the NRI. This is top priority. You can't build on it, and that's, I think it has become before us as a concept, but not as a development concept. Anyway, but I guess my question on the ownership is both, it goes to contiguity, I think, not the word, but also I would like to explore, is that within the intent of the conservation subdivision? That I have this space behind me. I'm not clear. If I own it all, my full lot, and yes, the back half of it is conserved, is it open to all of my neighbors?
No, not,
Or I just can't develop
just
a
can't
couple
develop,
of acres
correct.
back behind my house that I likely could not develop anyway, and is there,
Yeah, put your ADU there.
there's no real oversight at Hopkins Green,
Well, they could have a structure in the middle of the open space. I'm not saying they do, but I'm just saying there isn't, back when that subdivision was done, there wasn't a management plan. There wasn't a third part, it didn't go to a third party. There wasn't somebody out there looking it over, like now there's a stewardship fee, somebody's looking it over. So which approach do you, as a board, would you prefer the separate lot, or would you of open space, or does it not matter to you?
This is a different question from the
The
contiguous.
contiguous stuff, I
Oh,
think
sorry.
it's better if it's contiguous.
Okay,
they're similar.
yeah, they're related.
They're
They-
in a vein.
I was just answering.
When I hear someone referencing something they really like, Hopkins Green over and over again, I'm mindful that if that is something we want to encourage to be replicated within reason as land lots allow,
Mhm.
my approach would be to say, well, everything that you like about that, which would be non-contiguous because it goes around the outside, but it has the cul-de-sac in the middle.
Correct,
It allows for less than 100 feet because of the 50-foot
correct.
coming along there. But then on the flip side, as you're writing that, how do you create the guardrails on both sides so that you don't end up with the worst reading
Yeah.
of what you've just put together? And so my approach would be to first take everything you like about that and write it down, and then create the world's worst development from that, so that then you can say, okay, if someone took a gross misreading of this, what could they come up with?
Okay.
And then what language would we provide to stop that? Knowing that we're never going to get perfection, but let's avoid what we also think of as the worst. And so hearing myself say that aloud, I'm also would be curious, what do people think is the worst? And then what language exists to prohibit that within reason, obviously, because each of us have our own aesthetics. And I want to be mindful of not policing people's aesthetics, but I'm also mindful to everything you're saying that everyone here and everyone who shows up does not want them all along the road. And so how do we stop that, right? And I saw that in the original ordinance, these suggestions of what they should look like. Cool, no one's listening. So then what are we legally allowed to do to both support development while also being but not in a way that annoys the ish out of the neighbors when you drop 6 more houses in
Right.
that neighborhood.
Yeah.
Well said.
But I think that's a really.
Very well said.
Because
Uh-huh.
that developer could have come before the board with a standard subdivision with 7 houses with 3 or 4 maybe
Yeah.
by frontage.
Uh-huh.
So it doesn't really change hey, I don't want to build a road. It's expensive. So I'm going to see how many houses I can get along the
Uh-huh.
road. But in the meantime, we'll conserve this.
But I think what Alyssa's saying is the worst case scenario. What do you not want to see that maybe you've already seen? And then we'll work on writing something to try to avoid that.
Right, so write your best case, write your worst case, but preferably your worst case being a gross misreading of your best
Correct.
case, right? And from there, craft the ordinance, cross-checking it to make sure we're not doing anything illegal.
It's gonna be very difficult to write up for sure, but, you. But when it gets at the good, I want to suggest is you could always put in a provision which gets dangerous, but it is just, you know, the planning board shall have the authority from which to be able to grant a change in the design to
Which
the extent
we
that
have.
we have that now, but I mean, do we want to define it or do we?
It's
I
up to you.
prefer not to. I mean, then you could, if we have that ability, since we do have the ability, let me rephrase this. You know, Hopkins Green could still take place if somebody wanted to come in here with that and do the circle around it. Right? We would have that ability today.
You could make the
What about-
lots, you could allow them to make the lots smaller. You could, you know, there's a number of things in the interest of, and it lists what planning and so on. The interesting thing in that ordinance is the building envelopes between each other. I don't recall the exact language, but you're only allowed to waive up to 50% or a certain number, 25%. So the Farrington Corner Road subdivision, when I reached out and said, hey, this is more than what the board's allowed to waive, they had to make an adjustment to the distance between building envelopes. But there is a paragraph or something in there that gives you that ability. So I'm sorry to change topics, but are you guys interested in contiguous or non-contiguous? Or do you not,
I think
We're thinking that we.
or do you want to go with what Alyssa said?
Not spot.
Well, she didn't answer the question, but she summed up very well why I struggle with it so much, because I feel like you want to, like, what's the worst case scenario without naming any projects?
Right.
It's like when the conservation lane looks like broken glass, it just like got
Right.
scattered around the plot.
Okay,
But if you require absolute contiguity, then Hopkins Green doesn't work and smaller cottage courts won't work and. I'm
yeah,
like,
no, yeah.
It does work if we have the ability from which to sit there and say, you know, they can in fact have a 50-foot, you know, running trail around the entire development.
Maybe that's the
So-
answer.
Or acceptable, see,
Right,
you get into words like acceptable and not being able.
And I think the only dangerous thing with that is, I think,
I know, right?
being consistent with applicants.
Could you just?
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and not, you know, the applicant all of a sudden pop in and say, oh, you did this, you know, and it may be on a case by case. I say case by case, the applicant may not have been aware there was something unique about that particular property, the next applicant. All right, that helps me.
And sorry, guys, just one thing as we're talking about, well, we could make this allowance or we could adjust that here. I'm a millennial and I will do everything I can to avoid getting on the phone with someone. And so the more ambiguity that exists in the ordinance for an entire several generations coming that would prefer to read it and understand it, I'm mindful that, of course, including things like special exceptions may be made or like at the discretion of the board, but being as crystal clear as we can so that we don't have what's happening with this gentleman is so important to both encourage that, but make the best use of future planning board's time.
And then we have to trust the planning board, you know,
Yeah,
and, you know, it means that when we see something that may be of benefit is that we suggest it. And we
Well-
throw it out there to the developer to say, hey,
And Molly suggested that everybody wants the rural atmosphere of our town and the development like Hopkins Green. You know, the rest of the town hardly, you know, if all you see is the sign, you know, if you haven't driven up there, you don't know what's there, you don't really care. It's just trees around. And that's sort of, I think, what we were thinking when we wrote this, we changed this ordinance, 25 years ago? Long time ago. And well, maybe not 25, it was around 08 that we changed it.
15.
But I think that when that gentleman, that abutter came for the Farrington Corners, one with all the houses along across from his house, you know, he said, You know, I was living in the country and now I'm gonna see all these houses and they're gonna cut a bunch of the trees, because of course.
Yeah, but I think, we're getting that because the properties that are being developed are not Hopkins Green type properties.
No,
They're-
that's
They got a
true.
back part that's sort of subpar. And the best thing to do is put everything in the front because the back parts will go to conservation.
I think
I just don't think that's what we intended.
so.
Mhm.
Galloping Hill is a typical conservation subdivision. You
It's
still
not-
can't really see, houses. They're all clustered. Their open space, they've got big tracts of open space, so they aren't necessarily all contiguous, but they're pretty good
A
size.
bunch of it is hill.
Yeah. And then
Steep hill.
Cranberry Lane, which might have 5 homes on it, but they've got a huge track, I call it huge, but that goes from, again, there might have one small lot in the front that's conservation, but a lot of their open space backs all the way up to College Hill Road that they have. Wildwood is another one. You might see the first houses in there, but again, it's a pod out there of houses. So I think that was the approach that everybody was looking at.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I think,
And these last two developments, and which are sort of the first we've seen in years and years,
They
just blew
was
our
surprised.
minds.
Exactly.
Just blew our minds. They just weren't anything like.
They met the requirements.
Yeah.
It's just not what we're like, oh
Yeah.
God,
Right, can we establish like a stronger, I think was a good point, that like nobody reads this stuff, it's like, it would be nice to see this or that. But to Mike's point, if we can say we've got discretion or special, variance permission or exception, whatever, I can't remember the language, but like, can we make a stronger connection between the kinds of things we're trying to see, which are like houses clustered around little things that are on little roads that you can't see from the street, and our willingness to grant those kinds of exceptions to the contiguousness requirement or
Okay.
whatever.
A priority will be given, in order to get the thing you want, you have to do the thing we want.
Yeah.
And I also, obviously, they're all doing this for the density bonuses, correct? To be able to build more. And so then how do we make it clear that building more looks like X, Y, Z in Hopkinton? That this is what our plan for our neighborhoods looks
Mhm.
like.
Okay. A couple more questions and then I'll be done. What are your thoughts? And I really didn't realize this existed, the 100-foot wide wall area that was required. So you can't, the way it's written in there, your open space must be at a minimum of 100 feet wide. And I look at it, I read it as literally like everywhere must be a minimum of 100 feet wide. Even when you get to the street, it must be 100 feet. And, anywhere on the property must be at least 100 feet. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that's too detailed? Do you think that's?
I think it's a little too detailed, and the reason why is you could have a beautiful open space that's contiguous and everything, but the only place of access
It's a 50-foot.
is 99 point,
Yeah.
6, and so I think,
And maybe the 100.
you could say access in a length of no greater than, 100 feet or whatever, or you can bring it down and again, that's something that they could ask for an exception, can't
I
they?
know.
They could ask for an exception on it any time now.
Anybody else? Okay. So conservation priorities, that was something in our master plan also. And it's also as part of the preliminary application, they're supposed to prioritize the conservation land or prioritize it. And there's a listing of the priorities. And what we also use is the NRI for, highest priority as far as preservation and wildlife habitat or, and all that stuff. I think my recommendation is you be a little more clearer on that ranking, because I feel like people forget that ranking and its importance when they go to do the open space. A couple of the developments, I'm like, hey, so where's based on the NRI or the Fish and Games plan, where is the highest priority of conserved area should be? And they haven't even really looked. They just picked this area for open space because it worked, and I think that I would
So
point it out a little more.
So what you're asking is that the developer be able to point out how they prioritized it?
Why the open space was selected in that location.
And not just it fit their development plan for
Correct.
houses. To
Correct.
say like, okay, you're presenting to us, how did you meet our priorities for open space?
Correct. You
Which
say it so well.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Okay, all right. And then, let's see, priorities ranked. I guess that's it.
Do you want to talk? Oh, go ahead.
What was our answer on contiguousness?
Contiguousness, I really didn't get I kind of went on and hoping I'll figure it out, but you didn't really.
I think priority is given to contiguousness and that in the ordinance, we should encourage a developer who feels that they have a good reason example being in support of a primary conservation priority to
Mhm.
have non-contiguous, right? So let's say you're like, hey, it's gonna be non-contiguous, but I have two main sections.
Yes.
And they're gonna check off these two things on your priority list. That's worth listening to versus, oh, I could have gotten these two areas, but it's contiguous, so.
Yeah.
So maybe, and could we add to that or modify it to include both the sort of conservation priorities and also the, aesthetic, what we want to see kind of description?
And then, I think you might have just said this, but, if you want to have the shattered glass effect, show you why it has to be that way. Instead of just coming in with it,
Well, yeah,
Just
Yeah.
because.
you're trying to get that many lots.
Law.
if you identify those points and they have to justify it, then I think we'll see less of.
So would the simplest way to actually do this be to say, it's got to be contiguous, and if you don't want it to be contiguous, then come show us?
I would agree.
Yeah.
Basically, yes.
And Karen, on page 4
Of my
your
memo?
those are the recommended primary and then secondary priorities. Am I reading that right?
Page 4, yes.
Already there.
Comparison with New Hampshire other communities, is that what you're looking at?
For the primary conservation areas.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
above, yes.
Oh, sorry, yes, at the very top of the page.
Yes, those are, what I would consider as part of, so the wildlife habitat, that would be, I think it's on the NRI, it refers to, and I think Fish and, Game has a map that, puts the highest priorities and whatnot that we refer to. Yes, that would be my recommendations.
This is not a serious comment, but I cannot help myself. It would be hilarious to see a developer come in with a property that's covered in stone walls and be like, okay, you didn't have a minimum width, but look what I did. I'm saving all the stone walls.
Yeah.
Did happen.
We've heard that before.
So that's another confusing thing, believe it or not, they'll do a development, and I think the one on Farrington Corner, and they have to show all the natural features in there, and they show the stone wall going across like the middle of the whole project.
Yeah.
And abutters mistakenly think that's a property line, but no, it's a feature they have,
Yeah, yeah.
no, I agree with you totally.
But that would just be very funny.
One of the things, not to continue this much longer, we said that we would start talking about private roads.
I was thinking that could be an
The next-
incentive as far as, I know the Public Works Director is recommending it. It could be with an HOA organization is what I've seen. And I think we've talked about that, and Sam might have mentioned that, and the waiver of liability. That's document. Public Works would prefer that. Sam indicated Nashua does not allow public roads anymore. Their engineering department says they have to be private because of maintenance and expenditure.
At the last meeting, I'm relatively sure, and I'm so sorry if I'm blending things, I'm relatively sure that there was a person from a separate community who came in and spoke during the abutters section.
Yes.
Who was from a development that had a private road, and I believe she was actually saying, please don't let that be the case. I'm just naming out loud
Yeah.
that someone from a different community saw the subdivision on our agenda, came in and was like, just making sure it's not a
I think
private.
she was on the backside of Concord.
Yeah, she said she wasn't far from them.
Mhm.
So just naming that, I don't disagree, just
So-
think that someone felt that
I'm
passionate.
looking at like, River Grant. Now that's actually a driveway that crosses over, believe it or not, each building is on its own lot. It doesn't look like it, but that is, each lot has frontage, each building has frontage. The driveway just goes around. I mean, should that have been a public road? It's a driveway technically. Hopkins Green, not Hopkins Green, why am I on that? The other condo development, Smithfield. Now that is a town road. So I don't know, it can go both way, you know.
And I don't know either.
I was just thinking,
It's about-
cutting back on the expense of development and addressing DPW's, hey, I don't want to expend any more money on public roads if we can. And then Sam's comment, how he'd recommended it and Nashua doesn't do it. So I don't know. What are your thoughts? Do you want me to look into it?
Yeah, if you could look into it, I mean, one of the concerns that's always been expressed is that private roads ended up being all of a sudden public roads.
Yeah, there has to be some language in there. I'll give you a good example. Elmbrook Village. I can't remember if there's 50 units or 30 units in there. Those are all private roads. And according to our ordinance on manufactured housing, they must be private roads and they're developed to a certain standard. Those people in that development came in and tried to petition that they came to select board's meeting and wanted those to become public. Luckily, in defense of the town and the expenditure, the ordinance specifically said, and the developer signed, you know, when you do this development, they are to remain private. Now, some other roads, you know, if they're used private roads and they're used contiguously for 25 years or whatever the number is, and they happen to be maintained and all this stuff, you can petition and then they become public.
Maybe there's.
Though I do believe, because I attended a hard road to travel
Yes, tell
thing
me what
2
you
weeks
learned.
ago.
Yes.
And that was one of the first things they covered is public versus private and how does a private road become public? And there were 3 main ways. And I believe that they discontinued the way,
The 20-something years?
yeah,
Oh, I hope so.
that was in 1960. So anything that was built like before 1940, I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the exact dates, but there's a cutoff.
Okay.
And so at this point, the way it has to happen is
Yeah.
by petition to town and the select board accepting it. And so like, I'm relatively sure
Good.
at this point, nothing can just become
All right.
a road anymore, but I need to go back and
Yeah.
double check that. 'Cause we're
I
in 3
thought
main
it
ways.
was subject to town vote.
It is, it is, but
There was 2 ways. I think one involved the town and one involved the select board. but-
What if?
Little
in
Tookie
the
was a good
consideration
example.
Put in there, the roads have to meet the standards. as in
Yes.
Existence at the time of the application.
I did see that in one community, that the road has to either be brought up to the current standards or, you know, in order to convert it.
I would be, if we were to explore private roads, something I would want to know more about is the intersection of HOAs with affordable housing.
Mhm.
And so since we have an affordable housing bonus tied currently to our open space conservation, but an HOA inherently brings in additional costs, like have towns, what have you, that have mandated private roads only seen a dramatic drop in that use of that type of density bonus? Like, I'm just wondering if you're trying to do affordable housing, but then you're layering both property tax and HOA fee on it, that sounds very unaffordable.
That's a good point, and so I feel like I'm gonna say something that's not consistent with my values, but,
Oh, please
Were
don't.
we loud?
That's stop your ass. It doesn't stop any of us.
I think you're right that HOAs are a big problem for affordability and a whole lot of other reasons in a lot of communities. At the same time, it might not actually like show up in the sort of like in a planning board's assessment of what's affordable and you know, I'm sort of 2 minds here because I share your concerns about HOAs. On the other hand, because we like little cluster developments and cottage courts and Hopkins Greens and things like that, I want incentives for developers to build roads. And I think making them public roads and then forcing them to build them to town standards is really expensive.
Very much.
And so I worry, I like the idea of sort of encouraging private roads because I think it'll bring down the cost for the developers. even though I'm ambivalent about it because I think it'll affect affordability in the long run for the people that live there.
You think it will affect, oh, the HOA part of it, you mean?
Yeah, yeah. On the other hand, on my third hand, I'll say it's like good for the taxes for the town, right? And
Right.
everybody's concerned, justifiable.
And in that, I very much agree, we're how much behind in road maintenance? And so I completely hear and understand the DPW's concern about adding more roads to that list for them to maintain when we're just trying to fix what we already have.
They still would have to meet the standard for emergency access.
Yeah, and there may be, I mean, I'll be happy to go through and look at that, but there may be similar to the gravel road being permitted, no more than 5 lots or 5 houses. You know, you could always do it, no more than 5 houses or whatever. It could be a private road, if you wanted to take that approach and see how it is. You know, a 30 lot, I don't know, you know, so.
Is that something you could take a shot at too?
I will. I'll look at it and bring back something to you. I thank you for your time. It just gives me an idea of where to go from here.
Start.
That's so lovely that you took something from all of that conversation.
Well, trust me, I'll be listening to the tape, the recording again, but.
Thank you. Karen. Thank you.
Let's work.
But to your point, Rob, HOAs are, that is one reason why folks don't buy a house in it with an HOA, because, it can be costly.
Expensive and like governance challenges and.
And you've got regulations that are everywhere.
And I also wonder if in the reworking of the ordinance, if there are ways to have shorter roads with less frontage and less maintenance that might reduce some of that cost.
That's a good point because, and still go public.
Well, or be private, right?
Well,
But
the only
thinking either
reason
way.
I think the HOA part of it is in there is to make sure everybody that's in that development, that they're gonna maintain that private road. They're gonna plow it.
Your individual investment, that's
Yeah.
the intent.
But the shorter the road is.
Yeah, I
the less
agree.
Expensive it is. to
Yes.
maintain.
And that's one of the caveats of the conservation subdivision. You know, you only need 75 feet of frontage versus 300 feet of frontage. Therefore, your road is much smaller, shorter, and the cost is less. But in exchange, we would like some open space, you know.
And if you put them along an existing road, well, then you don't have to worry about either.
Yeah, true.
Well, I go to senior lunch now, I'm a senior. And
No.
there are a bunch of seniors that live in the meadows and in these places that have been bought out by equity companies who are trying to make money.
I don't know.
And their rental for their land that their house is on
Yeah,
is
because you buy that
just
property, but you
skyrocketing.
don't own the land, you just rent the land.
Right.
But they're not the only one. There are other ones. There's ones in Allenstown and a couple other communities.
This is
that
this
do-
is a nationwide thing happening. It's like the hospitals becoming
But
equity.
It's not, a couple of them are equity companies, but the current residents out there pay the same rent that they paid, with the exception, I think it's up to $25 increase. It's the new residents that go in there that have the increase. And then they also have to have a financial, there's,
And they can't write a check. They have to pay online, and you can imagine many of these old people are not very
and
facile at that.
I-
It's kind of,
it may be.
upsetting.
I know, but because it's an older community
Yeah.
of residents and that's apparently going to change. Which is bad. It was what we considered without officially, in the 80s and 90s, are close to affordable housing. That was as close as we could get, where residents could afford it. And now it's just, and then I know people that, have applied but not been accepted because they don't make enough money to ensure that they will pay the, so I think it's a different way. It's affecting everybody in one way or another in housing.
Crazy.
Okay.
Unless anybody has any other business? Motion? To adjourn. Second? Okay. Any opposed? No. Thanks, everyone.